It's been a very busy offseason for the Montreal Canadiens as they continue their rebuild. Laura Saba of Locked On Canadiens joins us to talk about their exciting draft, some players they've signed, and the outlook for the new season next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down or are actually finished, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Canadiens, Laura Saba. And Laura, anything but dull this offseason in Montreal. Let's start with the draft because I know you're super excited about that. 2 first-round picks. What excites you most about this draft?
I think the Canadiens knocked the first round out of the park. They did get some help, and we have to admit that, because a player like Ivan Demidov, like, we're still pinching ourselves. We're still, we're still wondering how this player was still available at 5th overall. Obviously, we got some luck in that the Columbus Blue Jackets refused to make a trade for other teams that may have wanted Demidov, even though they were pretty clear on the fact that they wanted Caden Lindstrom. They had their man, and they helped us out a lot with that. And obviously with Anaheim picking Beckett Seneca, most memorable moment, right? So, and the other thing too was that Chicago had fallen in love with a different Russian player, and because it would have made sense to, just imagine Demidov and Bedard together, right? Like, it would have made so much sense. So we did get very, very lucky. And I would say that the Canadiens, the more skill part, like the luck part was Demidov, and absolutely, like, just with that, if they had bombed every other pick, I think Montreal Canadiens fans would have been happy. He is a player with a tremendous amount of upside. He's got so much skill. There's so much excitement. There's so much excitement to his game, creativity to his game. This kid is going to be, as many public scouts have predicted, he could be the top scorer in the Canadiens within, 5 to 6 years, right? So Demidov is really the big name, but that second pick that they made, they did move up to get Michael Hage, and that, I think, people said that, oh, he's not a steal because the Canadiens still had to give up assets to get him. And I don't see it that way, because the fact that he was available there still at 21st is, it's very, very, very encouraging, because a lot of scouts had him at like top 15 in their draft boards. And this is a player, I think the exciting part is not the fact that, he grew up a Montreal Canadiens fan. That's the emotional part. That's the part that drew us in, right? He's a player that he overcame. He didn't really, I think he's still going through it. He lost his father the previous summer. And there's a lot that goes with that. But for him to be able to perform well enough to be drafted afterwards, like, that's somebody who has a determination. And I think what he brings to the game is a level of, I think, intelligence that the Canadiens need. And it's something that is quite underrated. But if you look at the Canadiens organization, like, there's a lot of hockey sense that they look for. There's a lot of intelligence that they look for. So that in itself was fantastic. And then, admittedly, most Canadiens fans didn't know a whole lot about the players that came after. The emotional pick of picking Atos Koivu, I think that was another thing. That was purely for the fans, right? They could have picked anyone there, and there might have been players that were better, or there were more of the best player available at the time. But the thing with Atos Koivu is that he's not a slouch. He definitely, like, a lot of scouts will say, we haven't even seen him scratch the surface of his potential just yet. He's still growing into his body, let alone growing into his game. So it's not like they wasted a pick, right? It's not like that. And so there was that as well. So, like, the Canadiens really pandered to their fans, I think, in this past draft. And then there's a lot of questions about some of the other players that they have. But I think the biggest thing was those three picks made the most noise for good reason.
No doubt. And then some big re-signings also over the course of this offseason, including in the last week or so. Why don't you fill us in on the impact of those?
Kent Hughes is now doing his homework. He took some time off. He was very quiet, but now he's going through the to-do list. So the first thing that we heard about was Arbor Jackie's contract, and he and Justin Barron were two of the RFAs that they had chosen to qualify. They did not qualify the others, but that doesn't mean that's the end of the road for them. But really, for the Montreal Canadiens, it was most important to get Arbor Jackie out of all of those, signed to a contract. Very, very economical contract, 1.3 million. And, the fact that the player is an RFA at this point, doesn't have leverage at this point, is kind of a moot point. Like, I think what the Canadiens have always had in Arbor Jackie being an undrafted is that he is a player that provides a lot of value for what he costs, right? They got him for free essentially, and for this kind of money, and he's a player that a lot of GMs covet, and so that his stock is always going to be high, even if the contract doesn't necessarily reflect that. And I think, in our episode today, we were saying that's coming out today, we were saying that Arbor Jackie provides to the Montreal Canadiens a value that, were he on any other team, he might not necessarily provide that same level. And so he's such an important player. That was the first one. And then it was Justin Barron, which was 1.15 million for 2 years. And that was a little bit less. And I think for Justin Barron, the biggest thing this year is he has to prove himself this year, because he has so much inconsistency. He has stretches where he seems like he doesn't belong in the NHL. And then he has stretches where it seems like, this was worth giving up Arturi Lehkonen for. That's who they traded him for. So this year is really his opportunity to prove he has a place in the Montreal Canadiens future, because if not, he's definitely one of the odd ones out. The Canadiens have so many defensemen. There's so many of them. Some of these guys are not going to be around when the Habs are good. So Justin Barron, I think this year is his opportunity. It is a 2-year contract, but he could get traded in the middle of that. So those were big signings. And then obviously the biggest one this past week was signing Caden Gooley to an extension. It was very interesting because they signed him to a 5-year extension. He wanted 8 years, and they didn't want that. And they flatly refused. He ended up agreeing to 5 years. But I think in the long run, that's better for him as well. For the Montreal Canadiens, this gives them an opportunity to see if he's worth more than that, if he's worth that big contract. And for him, the contract ends when he's still in his prime. So he has the opportunity to really cash in. It could be the kind of thing where it's like, well, I was cheap for this long and now it's time to pay me, and I still have some good years left. So I think it ended up benefiting both, because if he had gone for 8 years at maybe $7 or $8 million as opposed to the 5.5, I think, if there came a time where he wasn't worth that $7 or $8 million, where he didn't pan out the way everyone expects, then it would be an overpay. It would be, this would be following him around wherever he went. There would be a lot of weight to that contract. Whereas this way, it's, he has the opportunity to prove himself. He's still getting paid a significant amount, but he's got the opportunity to say, you know what, I've been your number one defenseman or your number two defenseman. Now it's time to pay me that kind of money. And he'll still be worth it, as opposed to a Brendan Gallagher, for example, who got paid for his past contributions, not for his future contributions.
Right. And then as the cap goes up, his next contract, if he plays well, will go up as well. So you got all these young players. You've accumulated a lot of picks, a lot of prospects. As you said, too many defensemen to even have all of them make the team. What is the timetable for this team to contend for a playoff spot?
So a lot of fans want to see it this year, this upcoming season. I think that's a long shot, but I think this upcoming season, they can no longer be content with finishing with a top 10 pick. They are unfortunately going to have to embrace that no man's land where you don't make the playoffs and you also don't get a top pick, but they have to be doing everything they can and fighting tooth and nail to get that wild card spot. Because to me, this is the opportunity for all those players we just mentioned to play lights out, be the best they can be, and for the Canadiens to be really able to gauge what they have in the pipeline. I think they should not accept anything less than that. It sucks for the fans, but for them, they have to take massive steps forward. So I think this upcoming year is not it, but the season after, like, not making the playoffs will be a disappointment. if you're going to talk about like, when are they going to be a Stanley Cup contender and when are they going to be a threat where other teams might not want to play them, I think we're maybe about 4 or 5 years from that. Definitely not sooner than that. But, if in the summer of 2026 they have not made the playoffs, or spring of 2026 they've not made the playoffs, then something went wrong.
All right. Well, Laura, I know you will have this covered every step of the way. Why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast, where they could find you and your new co-host on social media?
I do. I have a wonderful new co-host, Ian Boisvert. You can find him on social media at Maybe It's Ian. Our podcast is called Locked On Canadiens, and we are wherever you get this podcast, on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and we're free and available on social media. I'm at The Active Stick, and our show is at LO_Canadiens. Thank you so much, Gil.
Thank you, Laura. Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.